listening to the History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
That eye contact was real strange. Don't do that again.
Now I'm ready.
All right. So the IRA, so their main target throughout most of this conflict is going to be directly just the Irish Royal Constabulary Force, or the RIC. The British government, they have this armed police force in Ireland, and it's really concentrated outside of Dublin. And so its members, its barracks, especially the more isolated ones, they're vulnerable, and they have these much needed arms and ammunition that the IRA needs. Remember, I said at the beginning of this, their primary mission is to sort of raid and sack these garrisons, not so much to take out the personnel, but as to acquire the arms.
Right.
All right. So the RIC is going to outnumber. The RIC is going to be numbered at just under 10,000 troops. So they have 9,700, I guess I shouldn't call them troops, officers stationed in about 1,500 barracks throughout all of Ireland. But the Irish, remember we were talking a little bit ago about having many minds of this. Some of this is open warfare. Some of this is sort of guerrilla style. And then, others are putting forth the prospects of civil disobedience.
Sure.
Well, here's a social disobedience. A policy of ostracism is going to be adopted, and RIC men are basically going to be ignored. The Irish government, the Dáil, on April 11th, 1919, basically says, act like these people don't exist, down to your community level.
Ooh.
So you can see how this is going to start to kind of pull on the heartstrings of local communities. And this proves to be very successful in demoralizing the RIC force as the war goes on, because as people turn their faces from a force of Irish loyalists who, suddenly became increasingly compromised just by association with this group that's being targeted. It's like, you're wearing the uniform. We know you're not with us.
Right.
So as a result of the social ostracism, the rate of resignation went up and recruitment in Ireland dropped off dramatically. So the RIC suddenly is struggling to fill its ranks. Now, shunned and refused so often, the RIC frequently were reduced to legitimately buying food at gunpoint. So it wasn't even just about them being ignored. They weren't even able to do commerce, like purchasing of food for themselves in Ireland. Wow. So they would end up having to essentially more or less rob people just to eat. So some of the RIC men even went so far as to cooperate directly with the IRA through fear and possibly a sympathy, because you'll see this is a civil war without being a civil war. There are people that are trying to figure out things. They're for Ireland, but they're for peace. They're for, and I don't mean like peace between people, I mean like they're just not looking for a war, things like that. But they're going to be supplying valuable information and at times just leaving the doors to armories unlocked so that the IRA can acquire their arms.
Interesting.
Other aspects of mass participation in the conflict included strikes by organized workers who were in opposition to British presence in Ireland. So, civil disobedience. So in Limerick in April of 1919, a general strike is going to be called by the Limerick Trades and Labor Council. They're doing this as a protest against the declaration of the special military area under the Defense of the Realm Act, which covered most of Limerick City and part of the county as well. Special permits are going to be issued by the RIC, and you would need these passes to be required just to enter Limerick City. So remember we talked about the special military area, essentially martial law without being martial law. They can do all the things of martial law, but you know what they didn't declare?
What's that?
Martial law. Right. So sort of making up the rules as they go along, things like that. So the trades are now going to get involved. So they're not necessarily going to be physically fighting or destroying things, but now you're going to start to see things like some of the stuff coming up here. So, all right, so contrasting the effectiveness of the widespread public boycott of the police, the military actions carried out by the IRA against the IRC, as we have said, were going to be relatively limited. In 1919, 11 RIC men and 4 Dublin Metropolitan Police G Division detectives, and we'll talk about them in a minute, were killed and another 20 RIC were wounded. So you can see relatively small numbers. We are talking about a war. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people's expectations at the onset of this were going to be these huge casualty numbers and things like that. You won't see that in this war. It is a war no less, but you'll see that in a very important year, it was more about the acquisition of arms and resources versus the attacking of personnel directly. So 15 men killed and another 20 or 25 wounded is going to be more or less the casualty total for...
because we're not talking about a war that's been declared, right?
Well, British aren't even... They're looking at this as a police action.
Right.
Like a bunch of knuckleheads on the street are acting up. So they're not even considering the words revolt, rebellion. They're not looking at any of that.
Just a couple of people.
They're basically like constables, come handle these fools. British forces, in trying to reassert their control over the country, they're going to often resort to just straight up arbitrary reprisals against Republican activists and civilian population. An unofficial government policy of reprisals is actually going to begin in Fermoy, County Cork, when 200 soldiers of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry looted and burned the main businesses of the town on September 8th. After a member of their regiment, who is considered to be the first British Army soldier. So remember, we've talked about the different British forces. There's mostly police, even though the police we're discussing are very militaristic. I mean, they would resemble what a more modern police force were, in the sense that these guys are like ready to do battle, sure. Right? Military discipline, stuff like that. So the Shropshire Light Infantry Regiment has had one of their own, an actual regular Army soldier, killed in an armed raid by our IRA volunteers just the day prior. The IRA ambushers on September 7th were members of the Unit Number 2 Cork Brigade, who were commanded by a guy named Liam Lynch. They're going to go ahead and wound 4 other British soldiers and disarm the rest before fleeing their cars in the action that claimed that soldier's life. The local coroner's inquest refused to return a murder verdict, right?
Really?
So the local guy's probably an Irishman.
Okay.
Over the soldier, and the local businessmen who had sat on the jury were then targeted by the IRC for reprisal. So essentially, the coroner's like an Irish unionist, not a unionist. He's an Irish Republican. He's for the independent Ireland. He's like, no, he's not murdered. And then all the people that sign off on that are then subsequently targeted by the IRC for reprisal.
Okay.
Now, the IRA is going to be increasing their attacks, and by early 1920, they were attacking pretty consistently isolated RIC stations in rural areas, causing about 400 RIC barracks to be burned and abandoned and subsequently burned to the ground, essentially to prevent them from being used again. Get them out in the open, take what you can, eliminate whatever, but make sure that they don't have the resource to go back and re-garrison. In addition to burning about 400 barracks, 100 income tax offices are also going to be burned. And essentially all of this forces the RIC to withdraw from almost the entire countryside, leaving it in the hands of the IRA. So you can see how these...
Oh, no, wait, stop. Don't burn those tax buildings. No,
right.
Please.
So you can see how this sort of everywhere guerrilla activity has really put the IRC on their heels. Yeah. And at this point now they've left the area, and now the IRA is controlling most of the countryside.
It's a classic war of attrition, I guess.
Yep.
Really.
Wear them out.
Yep.
In June or July of 1920, the courts, I never pronounce this right, the courts of assizes failed all across the south and west of Ireland. Trial by jury could not be held because jurors just simply would not attend. The collapse of the British court system demoralized the IRC even further, and many police resigned or retired. So essentially they're out there, they arrest you for something, they charge you for something, and then it goes nowhere.
Yep.
And then eventually the prisoners, whoever, they're released and all that stuff, and it's really frustrating.
Was the court system, refresh my memory, I think we talked a little bit about it, right? Is this guilty until proven innocent?
Kind of.
Is it so if the juries didn't assemble, did the dude just stay locked up, or
In a lot of cases they're going to be turned free because you can't
prosecute?
But it's conditional, right? Because this is also a time where the English are kind of creating the rules of just indefinite imprisonment.
Got it.
So it's very sticky and situational. But the fact that they couldn't get the legal process rolling was a devastating blow to attempting any sort of reestablishment of order, right? I mean, you don't have a court system. You literally, the Irish are almost forcing the British to declare martial law.
Right.
Because that's a step towards recognizing what's going on.
Because that was my next that was one of my next questions. I was like, at this point, are the British starting to go, all right, something's happening over there, and we need to take a peek at it. And the Eye of Sauron just kind of
so check this
towards
out.
Gondor.
So check this out. So as we're saying, right, the collapse of the court system, the British court system in Ireland is really going to demoralize. In August of 1920, the chief secretary for Ireland, a guy named Hamar Greenwood, he's going to report from his office that 556 constables and 313 magistrates had resigned over this frustration of nothingness in a 2-month period.
That'll do it.
The Irish Republican Police, which was founded between April and June of 1920 under the authority of the Dáil Éireann. So essentially now we have an Irish police force coming in, and I can never say this guy's name. So the police were authorized under the Dáil Éireann, and the former IRA chief of staff, Cathal Brua, to replace the IRC. So essentially, all these resignations, all these abandonments of posts, things like that. Somebody's got to keep law and order. And as the IRA has controlled more territory, the Irish government is able to enact more of its authority, its rule over the island. And so such now they've created their own police force, essentially, to control the civil population. All right. So now back to some civil disobedience.
Ooh, that's my favorite kind of disobedience.
All right. So back to some civil disobedience. In May of 1920, Dublin dock workers are going to refuse on the docks to start handling any war material, and soon are going to be joined by the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, who had banned all railway drivers from carrying members of the British forces. So, we've talked about all this military or guerrilla warfare stuff going on. Now the troops, the British forces, can't even move around the country. They won't be allowed on the trains. The supplies of their food, of their ammunition, of their uniforms are no longer going to be even handled by the dock workers.
So this is really starting to heat up.
Yep. Blackleg train drivers were brought over from England after Irish drivers refused to carry British troops. The strike badly hampered British troop movements until December of 1920 when the strike was called off. The British government managed to bring the situation to an end when they threatened to withhold grants from the railway companies, which would have meant that the workers would no longer have been paid. So at the end of the day, as much muscle as the laborers could flex was flexed, but there's still a lot of economic ties to England, and so I can relate to that. You threaten the wallet, and suddenly your mind goes to a different place.
Yeah.
Now, Britain's Inland Revenue Department ceased collecting taxes and eventually stopped operations altogether in most of Ireland. So this is a really important development because the Inland Revenue Service is where a lot of the money that's being made directly from the population is coming from. People were instead encouraged to subscribe to the national loan. So since you don't have to really pay taxes anymore, the Irish government, who's now in charge, right, because the British had that mandatory Inland Revenue Service, revenue tax. Now the Irish have gotten rid of all that, right, now that they're there. And Michael Collins has set up what's called he's calling the national loan, which were to raise funds for the young government and its army. So essentially, they're Bernie Sanders. And once again, asking for your help, right, things like that.
Okay.
So they're not saying you have to pay this, but they really like you to.
Okay.
By the end of the year, the loan had reached about 358,000 pounds, and then eventually will reach about 380,000 pounds. So if
Can
you're
I ask what potentially might be a dumb question about a national loan?
Sure.
Was there ever like, hey, we'll pay it back?
Theoretically.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So that was language.
That was the
used.
intention.
Okay. So it's like, hey, lend us money, kind of fund. Like, did they tell like the countrymen what it was for?
I don't know that much about the national loan. I probably should have gone into that for this episode, but
no, that's fine. I was just wondering because they don't for any of our viewers or listeners around the globe, they just call it taxes here. They're like, yeah.
And they're mandatory.
Yeah, it's like you don't have an option of paying the Ben Franklin quote, right? Like there's only two things
and
in
remember,
life.
there's loyalists everywhere, so they're trying to make people sympathetic who are potentially loyalists. So they're like, look, we're not forcing you to do this.
So not forcing you to do anything, but
yeah,
you can pay in.
We'd really like you to be with us.
Yeah, then maybe someday we'll pay you back. That's really interesting.
So here's what's interesting, right? So you want to talk about sympathies? So
Okay.
over in Ireland, Michael Collins' direct national loan fundraising gets up to about 380,000 pounds. So if you're into money conversion, have fun with that one. How much was 380,000 pounds worth in the 1920 year? In America, where Irish President Eamon de Valera is, because he had been arrested after the 1916 Rising, and then was subsequently freed from prison in a jailbreak, and then escaped to America. He is going to raise, how much money do you think he raises?
Where is he in America?
Probably New York, Boston. He's in a number of places. I think he's in Washington at one point.
Well, there's a great deal of hatred for Irishmen at that time, so I'm just going to go say $20.
$5 million.
He raises $5 million?
Absolutely. There is a tremendous Irish population in the United States.
You know what? At that point, yes. This is not the 1800s anymore. This is 19, almost 20, right?
Yep. So anyway.
So yeah, that's right. Oh, wow. 5 million, 1920-ish dollars?
Yes.
So adjusted for inflation, like 87 gajillion, right?
Yeah. So
that's amazing.
All right, so let's take some context of the moment here. So the Irish have a controlling or a majority controlling interest in around 21 of 32 of the counties at this point. The countryside is almost completely in IRA hands. The IRC has been struggling to maintain its ranks, so you're going to see influx of troops soon. The Inland Revenue Tax Service is done. The British courts have collapsed, right? So a lot of things are starting to feel very Irish. So by mid-1920, the Irish Republic is a reality in the lives of many people already. It's enforcing its own law. It's maintaining its own armed forces. It's collecting its own taxes. The British liberal journal, The Nation, wrote in August of 1920 that, quote, "The central fact of the present situation in Ireland is that the Irish Republic exists." Period.
Nice.
All right. So despite the varying views on sort of how to conduct this this war here, the guerrilla tactics are going to be the prevailing one, and they're going to get back to work sort of carrying out raids on government property. They're looking for arms. They're looking for funds. They're targeting and killing prominent members of the British administration, which started with resident magistrate John C. Milling, who was shot dead in Westport County, Mayo, for having sent volunteers to prison for unlawful assembly and drilling. So a retaliatory assassination. He arrested a bunch of our guys, a bunch of Irish volunteers for just assembling, just being together and drilling. The charge doesn't say anything about being armed, which having a firearm is directly illegal and I think punishable by death immediately. So my guess would be this is a bunch of guys, a bunch of lads with hurling sticks, a bunch of hurleys, hurling paddles. So anyway, so to respond to that, the Irish volunteers just had him killed. They mimicked the successful tactics of the Boers, so we're not going to get into a history of it, but the Boer War was a bunch of fast and violent raids conducted by Dutch farmers without uniforms and things like that in an uprising in English colonial South Africa at the turn of the century. But the tactics were devastating on morale. and on frontline British troops, and it was something that the British had to tremendously adjust to. So here in Ireland, they're utilizing a lot of these lightning fast and hard to spot because the people are wearing street clothes kind of raids. All right, so now in September 1920, the British government becoming worried about the progress being made by this newly instituted Irish government and its Irish Republican Army, they're going to outlaw the Dáil Éireann throughout Ireland. So the British are saying that Sinn Féin, the largest Irish political party, is being proclaimed as outlawed, and essentially this is the moment where the Irish essentially say the gloves are off. The conflict is going to intensify. The British are saying, all right, what little we had given you back, we are now taking away again, right?
Yeah.
You can't have any of your own government, any of your own representation. And
they have a thing about not representing people in their parliament. if you've ever followed it.
Arthur Griffin, who is a member of the Irish Republican government, estimates that in the first 18 months of the conflict, British forces carried out just under 39,000 raids on private homes, arrested just under 5,000 suspects, quote, committed just over 1,600 armed assaults, carried out over 100 indiscriminate shootings and burnings of towns and villages, and directly outright killed 77 people, which included women and children. So suddenly the British have taken away the government and just started bringing the hammer to the Irish people. In March of 1920, to get things kind of kicked off with this insanity, Thomas Mac Curtin, the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork, was shot dead in front of his wife at his home by men who had blackened their faces and were later seen returning to the local RIC barracks. So we're in absolute insanity land, right?
What?
Now the jury at the inquest into his death returned a verdict of willful murder against David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, and District Inspector Swansea. We'll talk about him among others. Oswald Swansea, the RIC inspector, was later tracked down and killed in response to this, in response from McCurtain's murders. But the patterns of reprisal killings, like I said, this is going to go on between 1920 and 1921 when the war ends, when the reinforcements come. But, you saw that we had this moment where the British more or less snapped and they removed they attempted to, on paper, remove the significance of Irish authority. And so the IRA just starts to attack members, and the British just decide, instead of going small scale, they're going to just dramatically start raiding and things like that. And now we've just descended into this open kind of this for that assassination. You raid a bunch of homes, we're going to kill this group of officers, blah, 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 things like that. So it is truly a madness.
So you mentioned Lloyd George there for a second. What, did they kill him, you said?
No. So he was charged in the murder of this Sinn Féin mayor. The Irish symbolically charged him in the murder.
I was like, wow. Okay, so that totally. I was like, I don't think Lloyd George was murdered by the.
No. But what they did was they basically put him on trial. Not that he was physically present for it.
Well, we had this. If you think back to about 2005-ish, there was this, I think it was the state of Vermont that issued war crimes or whatever against George Bush and Dick Cheney for the Iraq War II. Remember that?
Not really.
They maybe it was a New England thing because I was in New England at the time, but the state of Vermont was like, we're holding the Bush administration, to blame for this stuff.
I'm guessing that went nowhere.
It went totally nowhere. Okay. But they said he's guilty of all these things that they put up. So it kind of reminds me of that a little bit, only this sounds a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean,
all right. So let's, the story kind of jumps all over the place because it's, again, this is probably something I should have said at the beginning of this. If your expectation for the Irish War of Independence was going to be one that is familiar to you in the sense that a lot of stories of independence revolve around these huge pitched battles and huge gunfights and things like that. There's not a lot of that. This is very much a this for that guerrilla type of retaliatory series of assassinations and small scale raids and attacks that have profound influences A lot of terrorism. Terrorism is probably a really good word to use. Things like that. So the story kind of jumps all over the place. This is related to that, but this overlaps this, things like that. So if you are lost, I do apologize. We'll try to get you back on track here. So let's get back on track by talking about who comes into play when the IRC is on its heels. Right? The Royal Irish Constabulary Police have been driven out of the country. They're struggling to maintain their ranks. So I did say a couple times that reinforcements will come in. So let's talk about the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries.
Yes.
So these newly arrived British forces are going to quickly become notorious and vilified by Irish peoples for their police brutality and attacks on civilians. The Black and Tans number 7,000 strong and consisted mainly of ex-British soldiers who had been demobilized after World War I. As a result, the conflict is sometimes called the Black and Tan War. The namesake of this unit derives from Major General Hugh Tudor, Parker, commander of the Royal Irish Constabulary and self-styled Chief of Police, who began supplementing this body of reinforcements with surplus World War I uniforms.
Okay.
Most of these guys came from English and Scottish cities. While officially they were a part of the IRC, in reality, these guys were a straight-up paramilitary force. After their deployment to Ireland in March of 1920, they rapidly, as I said, gained a reputation, but not just for violence and things like that. In their own ranks, they gained reputations for drunkenness and poor discipline. The wartime experience of most Black and Tans did not suit them for police duties, and their violent behavior was considered very antagonistic to many previously neutral civilians. So a bunch of Hellraisers showed up.
Yeah.
I don't want to call them that. So the IRA, having had a bunch of very successful late winter 1919, early spring 1920 raids and things that have gained them a tremendous amount of momentum and territory, the summer of 1920, the Black and Tans are just going to go outright ham on the countryside, and they're going to burn and sack numerous towns throughout Ireland, including Balbriggan, Trim, Templemore, and others. And these acts of reprisal, which are occurring between April and August of 1920, include over 100 grain mills, creameries, and other economic targets. So they're not just indiscriminately burning. Now they're burning to destroy, but destroy things that also hurt you economically, food-wise, things like that. In July of 1920, the other quasi-military police body of reinforcement shows up, the auxiliaries, the Auxies, as they're known. And these guys are about 2,200 strong, former British Army officers. They had a reputation just as bad as the Black and Tans for the mistreatment of the civilian population. But these guys tended to be more effective and willing to take the IRA on directly. Okay. The policy of reprisals, which involved public denunciation or denial and private approval, was famously satirized by Lord Hugh Cecil when he said, quote, "It seems to be agreed that there is no such thing as reprisals, but they are having a good effect." So British leadership is not officially saying these things are happening, but they're not mad that they're happening. But they don't know officially that they're happening.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not happening.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right.
Okay.
On the 17th of July, 1920, Colonel Gerald Smith of the Royal Irish Constabulary is going to be assassinated by the IRA in County Cork. He allegedly told police officers to shoot civilians who did not immediately obey his orders. Smith had came from Bainbridge, County Down. He was an Irishman himself. Local loyalists retaliated by attacking many Catholic homes and businesses in Bainbridge, expelling Catholics from their jobs and forcing many to leave town. A couple days later, on July 21st, loyalists drove 8,000, quote, disloyal co-workers from their jobs in Belfast shipyards, all of them either Catholics or Protestant labor activists, some of them being viciously attacked. So imagine a pot of water and the heat under it is just constantly being cranked.
Yeah, yeah.
The expulsion sparked fierce sectarian rioting in Belfast, and British troops used machine guns to disperse the rioters. Okay. At the end of the first day, 11 Catholics and 8 Protestants were killed and hundreds others wounded. Catholic workers were soon driven out of all major Belfast factories, In response, the Dáil approved the Belfast boycott of unionist-owned businesses and banks within the city. It was enforced by the IRA, who would halt trains and lorries and destroyed any Protestant goods it could get its hands on.
So this is just fun for everyone.
All right, so jumping back around again, we talked about Oswald Swansea. Here we are officially talking about it. On August 22nd, 1920, the IRA is going to assassinate Inspector Oswald Swansea as he left church in Lisburn. He had been implicated in the killing of Cork Mayor Thomas McCurtain. In revenge, loyalists burned and looted hundreds of Catholic businesses and homes in Lisburn, forcing Catholics to flee. So a mayor is killed. In response to that, the officer is killed. In response to that, people are just forced out of their homes for being sympathetic to the mayor, and it's just madness, right?
That's wow.
In September, Unionist leader from Northern Ireland, James Craig, wrote to the British government demanding that a special constabulary be recruited from the ranks of the Ulster Volunteers, so Irishmen who are loyal to the crown. He warned, quote, "Loyalist leaders now feel the situation is so desperate that unless the government will take immediate action, it may be advisable for them to see what steps can be taken towards a system of organized reprisals by the rebels." In addition to bolstering the ranks of British forces in Ireland, the British government implemented an act of parliament known as the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act of 1920, which had the goal of increasing convictions of nationalist rebels while averting the need to declare martial law. So again, England's trying not, because the moment you declare martial law, you bring international law. So they're trying to avoid doing that, but they are essentially passing legislation about how we're going to just end all this.
And like we already mentioned, like how popular they were in the United States, that's going to be a huge problem for them if all of a sudden, yeah.
So again, kind of talking about what we're talking about here, Britain was cautious not to put a match to a powder keg. Under Section 3, Paragraph 6 of the Act, military authorities were empowered to jail any Irish person without charge or trial. Secret courts martial were established, and lawyers who were appointed by Crown agents who could only be present if the death penalty was involved and only present on the day of the trial. It's crazy. And essentially, here's... Wait, just if it's not maddening enough for you, what do you do if you don't agree with this situation? Who do you take it up with? You can't, because here's why. Inquests of military or police actions are banned. So we can do what we want, and you can't ask us about it.
This is the country that in just a few years prior was saying, we're going to go make the world free. You know, well, we're going to go liberate the world from this, you know, this German fella named Willie the Deuce.
Yeah.
And we can't even give that to our own people.
Right.
You know, I mean, and this is the thing, I guess, that gets, as I know that the Irish are fighting for their independence here, but these are technically their people. Like, these are people that fall under their realm. And they're doing this to their own people.
Yep. So, all right. So
that's just unforgivable.
So the military-style courts-martial extended to cover the entire population of Ireland. These guys were empowered to use the death penalty at their discretion. And this act has been interpreted by historians as a choice that Prime Minister David Lloyd George would make to put down the rebellion rather than negotiate with Republican leadership. So they're looking at this. Most historians, I guess, would say agree that this is the moment, the possibility of solving this amicably was over. David Lloyd George now says, you want to fight? We're going to fight, but we're going to fight our way. One of the first court-martials that is going to happen is going to be in October of 1920, and it's the court-martial of 18-year-old Kevin Barry. Barry had been captured by British troops on September 20th of 1920 when a party of Dublin IRA, including the young man, attempted to ambush soldiers guarding a British Army lorry. So a lorry is kind of like a troop truck.
Right.
In an attempt to capture the soldiers' weapons. During the ambush, 3 British soldiers had been killed. Although there was no evidence as to a specific killer, Dublin Castle elected to try Kevin Barry under the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act for, quote, offenses of such a character they cannot be adequately dealt with by a court of summary jurisdiction. Quote, the formal order convening the General Court-Martial was issued on October 15th, 1920, charging Berry with 3 counts of first-degree murder relating to the 3 dead soldiers. During the subsequent trial, Berry refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction or present any evidence in his defense. He was found guilty of the first charge, resulting in the dropping of the other charges, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. Berry's sentence was publicly announced on October 29th, 1920, and it was stated that he would be executed at Mountjoy Prison in 3 days' time. The Republican press responded with scathing condemnation of the pending execution of a mere boy and referred to him as Master Kevin Berry. Notwithstanding public outrage and the attempted intervention of the Archbishop of Dublin and the Lord Mayor of Dublin and the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Sir John French, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, refused to modify the sentence. A last-minute telephone appeal directly to Prime Minister David Lloyd George's office was also firmly rebuffed.
Wow.
At Mountjoy Prison at 6 a.m. on Monday, November 1st, crowds began to gather and hold vigil. By 7 o'clock, some 2,000 people were estimated to be present, and the crowd is going to continue to grow. British authorities reacted by bringing up an armored car that drove straight through the crowd and stopped with its machine gun turret trained on the crowd. I want you to keep that visual in mind. We're going to come back to that.
Okay.
Notwithstanding the intimidation, at 7:45 a.m., a contingent of the Kumanbam, I don't know if I pronounced that right, the Women's Auxiliary of the IRA marched up in uniform and knelt in a line outside the prison to conduct prayers. Inside the prison, Kevin Berry was hanged at 8 o'clock in the morning. Canon John Waters and his assistant, Father Matthew McMahon, had arrived at Berry's cell an hour earlier to celebrate Mass and witness the execution. Afterward, they described the scene to the press in terms that all but sanctified Berry. They reported that Berry received them in his cell with rosary beads in hand and a smile on his face. He was cheerful and unmoved, and after the Mass, as he proceeded to the gallows, he never flinched or wavered. When the executioner approached to blindfold him, he stated that he did not want it, as that he, quote, he was a soldier and not afraid to die. His last thoughts were not of this world. He died a brave and beautiful death, said Canon Waters, marked by great humility and resignation to the will of God. He died a holy and Christian death. He died with prayers on his lips for his friends and enemies. Father McMahon agreed that he, quote, he was as brave as a lion and died as holy as a saint. And he added, he must have passed straight into heaven as a reward for his perfect resignation to death and his acceptance of God's divine will. Now, the headline in Tuesday's Irish Independent announced, quote, execution of Kevin Berry in Mountjoy, without a tremor to the end, asked for no pity, but requested Irish prayers. Not to be outdone, the Freeman's Journal proclaimed, the heroic sacrifice. Kevin Berry yields his life for Ireland without flinching. A brave boy's fortitude. He goes to the scaffold praying for his friends and enemies. The Journal's editorial ennobled Berry's death by saying, quote, vengeance has been wreaked upon the schoolboy Kevin Berry. The vengeance is blind. It adds to the tragedy that he died with more than a man's courage, but in the temper of a Christian. He might have saved his life by giving the names of his comrades. The offer should have canceled the sentence. He refused, though the scaffold gloomed upon him, but he died praying for his executioners. He had just arrived at the years when the soul of a boy is fullest of generosity and noble sentiment. Such lads as he are the salt of a nation and the salt of an earth. The ghastly thing about this strife is that it is the very best and most generous of the young manhood of Ireland that has been driven to revolt and is now being warred upon. In Dublin Castle...
That's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that's... Wow. What an image. They don't write them like that anymore.
In Dublin Castle, they're going to contrast the sanctification of Kevin Berry by issuing no press release or any public explanation of the rationale for the sentence, thus ceding a complete propaganda victory to the Irish Republican cause.
100%. I'd say, yeah, point
The only official statement from Dublin Castle about the execution was the posting of the following notice on the prison gate shortly after 8 a.m. Quote, "The sentence of the law passed on Kevin Barry, found guilty of murder, was carried into execution at 8 a.m. today by order."
Good job. Good job, England.
The combination of growing police and military pressure and recourse to the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act led to increased internments of known or suspected IRA members. So remember, that act of Parliament basically said, we can arrest you for anything we want. So we could just say we suspect you of something. So increased arrests and internments are going to take place, and they're going to basically start to happen at a rate of 50 to 60 convictions a week. This is going to make it more difficult for IRA soldiers to continue openly working their day jobs, because remember, these guys are essentially part-time guerrillas. They work on the docks, and then when their unit gets called, they go out and then they slip right back into civilian life. So it's going to be harder to kind of operate in both worlds. As a result, the IRA is going to shift its approach outright to guerrilla-style warfare, especially in the rural counties, and volunteers from IRA units are now going to be organized into elite, full-time, mobile flying columns of around 25 men whose job is going to be essentially to live off the land and on the run. These flying columns are going to be more suited for ambush styles, attacks of patrols and convoys, as well as other target opportunities, rather than these head-on attacks of defensible barracks, which had become much better defended as the short war so far had progressed. About 300 people are going to be killed by the end of late 1920, but the conflict, Parker, is going to escalate even further still in November of that same year, 1920, on what became known as Bloody Sunday, November 21st, 1920. All right, Parker, let's talk about Bloody Sunday.
All right.
So the day is going to begin with an IRA operation. It's going to be organized by Michael Collins, and its goal is to assassinate the Cairo gang. And every time I see that, I want to say Cairo because of my Civil War, American Civil War roots. But in this context, it's the Cairo gang. These are a group of undercover British intelligence agents working and living within Dublin. IRA operatives went to a number of addresses and killed or fatally wounded 15 of these agents. Most of them were active or former British Army officers. One of them was an RIC sergeant, and two of them were Auxies who were responding to the attacks, these 15 deaths.
Okay.
At least 2 civilians were killed, but the status of some of those killed is kind of unclear, so we're not really sure how they died. The records are very, 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 very murky. 5 additional people are going to be wounded, and these assassinations are going to spark a general panic among British authorities, and many of the agents are going to flee the streets of Dublin for the safety of Dublin Castle. Michael Collins, again, Minister of Finance, Director of Intelligence, leader of the the assassination part of the IRA movement, justified the killings on the morning of Bloody Sunday in this way. He said, quote, "My intention was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens. I have proof enough to assure myself of the atrocities which this gang of spies and informers have committed. If I had a second motive, it was no more than a feeling of such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. But by their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. For myself, my conscience is clear. There is no crime in detecting in wartime the spy and the informer. They have destroyed without trial. I have paid them back in their own coin."
Wow.
Yep. So, later that afternoon, British forces are going to respond by raiding a Gaelic football match at Croke Park, which is Dublin's GAA grounds. GAA is the Gaelic Athletic Association. Black and Tans and Auxies, as well as British soldiers, are going to be sent there in response to the morning's killings to carry out what is officially known as a cordon and search operation.
Do you maybe want to go into what a cordon and search operation is for anyone who...
Yeah, they're basically going to isolate people and search them just to see who's got what on them. And their hope is, because these killings have been so widespread across the city, that one of the places they might hide is in this very out in the open public gathering at the GAA match, at the Dublin versus Tipperary match of Gaelic football. So this match is being played between Dublin and Tipperary.
That was another one of my questions. I was like, do we know who was playing?
Yeah. Dublin. It was Dublin and Tipperary.
Okay.
And the goal with ticket sales was to raise money for the Republican Prisoners Dependent Fund. So essentially, you get grabbed under the Restoration of Order Act, and you're in jail indefinitely. You're not even charged with anything yet, but your family has still got to eat, and they're relying on you. So the money from this match is being raised to go towards the dependents of these essentially political prisoners.
Yeah, of course.
Despite the general unease throughout all of Dublin's population as the news of the assassination spread, at least 5,000 spectators attended the match at Croke Park, which incidentally is just going to begin 30 minutes late. So just one of those things. How many things would have been different if the game started on time? It's a speculatory thing, but I just felt it was interesting that as I was reading it, I was like, oh, and the match starts late. 10 minutes into the match, a convoy of troops in trucks and 3 armored cars are going to drive in from the north, and they're going to halt along the Cunliffe Road. A second convoy of RIC police are going to drive in from the southwest along Russell Street and Jones Road.
Oh, it's my street.
Yeah, that's right. That one's comprised of 12 trucks of black and tans in front and 6 trucks of Oxys behind. Several other plainclothes auxiliaries also rode in front with the black and tans. Their orders were to surround Croke Park, guard the exits, and search every man. The authorities later stated that the intention was to announce by megaphone that all males leaving the grounds would be searched and that anyone leaving by any other means would be shot. However, shots were fired by police almost as soon as they reached the southwest gate at Royal Canal end of Croke Park at about 3:25 p.m. So the British forces arrive and almost immediately start shooting. Some of the police are going to later claim that they were fired on first as they arrived outside of Croke Park, allegedly saying that IRA sentries had spotted them, but other police at the front of the convoy did not corroborate this, and there is no convincing evidence currently presented for it. Civilian witnesses all agreed that the RIC had opened fire without provocation as they were storming onto the grounds. 2 Dublin Metropolitan Police constables on duty near the canal gate did not report any firing before the IRC started firing on the crowd. Another constable testified that the RIC group also arrived at the main gate and began firing their guns into the air. Correspondents for the Manchester Guardian and Britain's Daily News interviewed witnesses and concluded that, quote, IRA sentries were actually ticket sellers. So when the scalpers essentially out front.
Oh my goodness.
And I shouldn't say scalpers because it's the custom at these Gaelic football matches for ticket sellers out front to be there on behalf of the organizations, behalf of the stadium, things like that. And these...
Like they weren't doing anything illegal. They weren't...
Right, but to train people, they shouldn't look like a picket.
Oh, I'm sorry. They were doing something illegal, standing while being Irish.
You're exactly. In British Ireland at that point, that's true.
Their own citizens. Their own citizens.
Here's a quote to kind of speak to that sort of that kind of oppression that you're talking about. When commenting on how these ticket sellers were mistaken for pickets, the British Daily News wrote that no man exposes himself needlessly in Ireland when a military lorry passes by. So it's not like they were just standing out there.
Right.
They were doing their jobs.
Right.
Now, the police and the convoy's leading trucks appeared to have jumped out, run down the passage to Canal End Gate, forcing their way through the turnstiles and started firing rapidly with their rifles and revolvers. Ireland's Freeman's Journal reported that, quote, the spectators were startled by a volley of shots fired from inside the turnstile entrances. Armed and uniformed men were seen entering the field, and immediately after the firing broke out, scenes of the wildest confusion took place. The spectators made a rush for the far side of Croke Park, and shots were fired over their heads and into the crowd. The police kept shooting for about 90 seconds. Their commander, Major Mills, later admitted that his men were, quote, excited and out of hand. Police fired into the fleeing crowd from the pitch, or the field for you Americans, while others outside the grounds opened fire from the canal bridge at spectators who had climbed over the canal wall while trying to escape. At the other side of the park, soldiers on Cunliffe Road were startled first by the sound of the fusillade, then by the sight of panicked people fleeing the grounds. As the spectators streamed out, an armored car on St. James Avenue fired its machine guns over the heads of the crowd, trying to halt them.
Again, with a machine gun aimed at the crowds, like we were talking about before.
That's why I said keep that image in there, because here it's actually happening. It's not being threatened.
It's like England said, all right, everybody. All right, chums. What did we learn from that little American Revolution thing? Nothing. Okay, great. Now let's do it in Ireland, only now we have machine guns, and let's do it worse.
Sure. It's interesting that you say that, because if you think about it, they've been in Ireland far longer than they were in the Americas.
1,000,000%.
Right. So by the time Major Mills is going to get his guys back under control, 7 people are dead outright. 5 more people are mortally wounded, and another 2 people would die as a result of the crowd crush. The dead include Jane Boyle, who's the only woman killed, who had gone to the match with her fiance and was due to be married 5 days later. 2 boys, ages 10 and 11, were also among the killed. And football player Michael Hogan is going to be fatally shot. He's a player. He's the only player that is killed during the attack. And then there were dozens and dozens and dozens of other wounded and injured, while the police raiding party suffered how many casualties, Parker?
0.
0.
Because they were under no threat at all?
Correct.
Zero threat.
Once the firing...
Britannia rules the waves, massive army, all the weapons. They were literally under 0 threat.
Yeah, but these are your people. Remember, you started with your British.
Nope,
going to hold it against you forever.
That's fine.
Once the firing stopped, the security forces searched the remaining men in the crowd before letting them go. The military raiding party recovered 1 revolver. A local householder testified...
Oh, no. I'm clutching.
Wait. A local householder testified that a fleeing spectator had thrown it into his garden. The British authorities stated that they found 30 to 40 additional revolvers upon searching the grounds. However, Major Mills stated that no weapons were found on the spectators or on the grounds.
These people were just probably looked down. Oh, bloody hell, look what I have.
Look, it's a rock. We'll call it a gun.
We'll call it a gun.
Now, the actions of the police were officially unauthorized and were greeted with horror by British authorities in Dublin Castle. In an effort to cover up the nature of the behavior of British forces, a press release was issued which claimed...
Da-da-da-da.
A number of men came to Dublin on Saturday under the guise of asking to attend a football match between Tipperary and Dublin. But their real intention was to take part in a series of murderous outrages which took place in Dublin that morning. Learning on Saturday that a number of these gunmen were present in Croke Park, the Crown forces went to raid the field. It was the original intention that an officer would go to the center of the field and, speaking from a megaphone, invite the assassins to come forward. But on their approach, armed pickets gave warning, shots were fired to warn the wanted men and caused a stampede, and they escaped in the confusion.
What does the Crown...
So despite the evidence, we're sticking with the story.
Right, we're going with the story. So my question is, this is reprehensible. There's nothing redeemable about this whatsoever. What does the Crown and perhaps Lloyd George, Parliament, etc., I'm just going to call it the the Crown. I know they're separate. I know they're separate parties. But what is the official position of England on this at this point, or are we too early to assess that, to arrive at this yet?
I think we're a little early.
A little early. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Because there's more. Bloody Sunday is not over.
Not over.
Later that night, 2 high-ranking IRA officers, Dick McKee and Peter Clancy, together with another man whose name is Connor Clune, were killed in response while they were being held at Dublin Castle. So these guys, McKee and Clancy, had been involved in the planning of the assassinations, allegedly, of the British agents who were taken out early in the morning and had been captured in a raid hours before the assassinations had actually even taken place. Clune was a member of the Gaelic League. He had been arrested on a completely different raid at a hotel that the IRA members had just left. He might not have even been involved. He had joined the Irish Volunteers shortly after it was founded, but it was unclear if he was even active. But nonetheless, he is murdered by the British forces as part of a reprisal on Bloody Sunday. Dublin Castle's official stance on the deaths was that because there was no room in the cells, the prisoners were placed in a guard room containing arms, and they were killed while trying to escape. They allegedly threw hand grenades, which mysteriously did not detonate. Then they fired at the guards with a rifle, but missed. They were then subsequent. Are
they Imperial stormtroopers?
I knew you were going to say that.
What the actual fuck?
They were then subsequently allegedly shot by the Oxys.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so medical examination though.
Oh, good.
Is going to find that these guys had tons of broken bones and abrasions consistent with with prolonged assaults and bullet wounds to the head and body. Their faces were covered in cuts and bruises. McKee had an apparent bayonet wound to his side.
Oh, Joshua Chamberlain was there.
Michael Lynch, an IRA brigade commander, stated that McKee suffered severe beatings prior to being shot to death, saying, quote, "I saw Dick McKee's body afterwards, and it was almost unrecognizable. He had evidently been tortured before being shot. They must have beaten Dick to a pulp. When they threatened him with death, according to reports, Dick's last words were, 'Go on and do your worst.'" One IRA member was captured during the assassinations in the morning, and several others were arrested in the following days. Frank Teeling, who had been captured, was tried for the killing of Lieutenant H. Anglis of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, otherwise known as Mr. McMahon.
So I just did a quick search on Henry Anglis, and it turns out that Patrick McMahon was his cover name.
Oh.
So he was, that was British
alias.
intelligence.
This is alias.
Yes.
Nice. All right, well, the prosecutor opened the trial with an account of the incident, which says, at about 9 o'clock, two men came to the front door, one of whom asked for Mr. McMahon and the second for Mr. B. The men dashed upstairs, and one of them, the prisoner, went to Mr. B's room. The other man went to Mr. McMahon's door. The men knocked at their doors, and more men with revolvers came into the house and ran up the stairs. The servant called out to warn Mr. McMahon, and she saw Teeling enter the room, followed by others. He called out, "Hands up!" And Mr. McMahon and a companion occupying the same room were covered with revolvers by 5 men, 2 of whom would be identified as Teeling and Mr. Potter. Mr. B barricaded his door, and Conway fired shots through it. Mr. McMahon's companion got under the bed while Mr. McMahon was being shot, and then the men left. It was then found that Mr. McMahon was dead, having been wounded in 4 parts of his body.
Wow.
Now, Teeling is going to be convicted and sentenced to death, but before he is executed, he's actually going to be freed in a prison raid by Michael Collins himself. So he will escape from jail. More IRA guys who were arrested in response to the actions of Bloody Sunday. Thomas Whalen, James Boyce, James McNamara, and Michael Tobin are later arrested as suspects in the assassinations, with only Whalen being convicted. And he's going to be executed on March 14th, 1921. Patrick Moran was also later arrested, and he was sentenced to death for killings that were done at the Gresham Hotel, and he was also executed on March 14th. There was no public inquiry into the Croke Park massacre, Parker.
Okay.
Instead, 2 British military courts of inquiry into the massacre were held in secret behind closed doors at the Mater Hospital and at the Jervis Street Hospital. More than 30 people gave evidence, most of them anonymous black and tans, Oxys, and British soldiers.
And we can trust everything they say.
One inquiry concluded that the unknown civilians probably fired first.
Of course.
Either as a warning of the raid or to create panic. But it also concluded that the fire of the IRC was carried out without orders and exceeded the demands of the situation.
Okay. All right.
So it interestingly did find some culpability.
That's good.
With British forces.
That's good.
Major General Boyd, the British officer commanding Dublin District, added that, in his opinion, the firing on the crowd was, quote, indiscriminate and unjustifiable, with the exception of any shooting which took place inside the enclosure. The findings of these inquiries were suppressed by the British government and only came to light, Parker, in the year 2000.
Wow.
So about 80 years later.
Wow, that's great.
When Joseph Devlin, who is an Irish Parliamentary Party member in the British Parliament, tried to bring up the Croke Park massacre in Westminster in 1920, he was shouted down and physically assaulted by his fellow members of Parliament. The circus, I guess, of that got so out of hand that Parliament was actually temporarily suspended. So continuing this escalation, right? So we've had this absolute anarchy breakout with the Auxies and the Black and Tans. The IRA started the morning of what became known as Bloody Sunday with an incredibly brutal series of assassinations on British agents. From there, we had this massacre, this civilian massacre at Croke Park, and it's only going to keep escalating from here. In the week after what is known as Bloody Sunday, the IRA is going to kill 17 Auxies in one of the most devastating of their ambush attacks. It's known as the Kilmichael ambush in County Cork. You can actually see a really great depiction of this in the 2007 film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley. I asked you to watch this as part of your homework. It features a very young Cillian Murphy. Great film. It's probably one of my favorites to talk about this story.
It looks like a great film. I actually rented it, ran out of time because I developed plague. And then failed to turn in your homework, and as such... You're still waiting on the whole Matilda thing.
Yeah, dude, you know what? And it's so long that I forgot about it. Yeah, now I remember.
You're welcome.
So the IRA assassinations are going to spark panic amongst British military authorities, and numerous British agents are going to, as I have said, flee to Dublin Castle for safety. So they no longer feel like they can even operate within the city limits. So they have to go strictly to the compound where the most British military presence is. So the Irish Republican Army is waging, I guess you could say at this point, an effective guerrilla war to destroy these elements of British authority and power. These people are afraid to be in the street. In addition, as I said, to these assassinations, courthouses are being burned throughout the countryside, and in the city, ambushes are being set against RIC troops. And this moment this method, this tactic of warfare, as we said, is devastating. All right, so let's talk about the guy behind the IRA, who's really driving things at this point. The IRA has had a very successful year of 1920. You know, they control most of the countryside. They have gotten the streets of Dublin very nervous for the safety of the British agents that are working in the shadows and out in the open. So they're directly retreating to the source of the center of power, the heart of power in Dublin, the British power rather, things like that. So let's talk about the guy kind of making that happen. The success and effectiveness of the IRA at this point can be directly attributed to Michael Collins. He was a member of the Irish government and a driving force behind the independence movement. He was officially a minister of finance in the Irish government as well as the director of intelligence. He was involved in providing funds and raising arms for IRA units and in the selection of its officers. Collins had imposing size, charisma, and organizational capability, which galvanized many of the people who came directly in contact with him. He was called Mick, or the big fella, because he was frickin' huge, and he established what proved to be an effective network of spies among sympathetic members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police's G Division and other important branches. There's that G Division again. Let's talk about what the G Division is, Parker.
I was just going to say.
Because the G Division were largely the targets of that Bloody Sunday morning assassination operation, in addition to the Cairo gang.
Did they say, "What's up, G"?
No.
Oh.
The G Division were a relatively small political division that was active in subverting the Irish Republican movement. They were detested by the IRA as they had frequently been used to identify volunteers who would have previously been unknown to British soldiers or later the Black and Tan. So these guys, the G Squad guys, the G detectives, are essentially guys that gather intelligence down to knowing what they eat for breakfast, as Michael Collins used to say. Is they know what we eat for breakfast. We need to know what they eat for breakfast. Liam Neeson, Michael Collins. But my point is these guys were in charge with gathering intelligence. A lot of these guys were Irish themselves. And when a lot of the people like Michael Collins and stuff didn't have a picture to go with their personnel files, these G detectives were used to more or less point them out, things like that, or identify them in photographs where the British forces didn't know who was who.
Narcs.
In a way. So these guys are very, very important, though, to British efforts. Without the G Squad, the information that the British might have is more or less useless. So Collins, in response, is going to set up the season. He's going to set up the squad. which is a group of men whose sole duty was to seek out and kill members of the G-Men. Collins' squad began killing RIC intelligence officers and G-Men in July of 1919. Many of the G-Men were first offered a chance to resign or leave Ireland, or stay and face the consequences. One spy who managed to escape with his life was a guy named F. Digby Hardy, who was actually exposed in a bit of political theater by Arthur Griffin, who was a member of the Irish government, as I've said. The meeting was basically set up as this G-Man is going to be invited to a secret IRA meeting, so he'll be able to gather all this intelligence and bring it back to the castle and everything and blah, blah, blah. But what happens is it's instead of IRA members, it's actually Irish and foreign journalists who witnessed this guy basically being brought into the room and then being outed as a spy in front of everybody. And what it really did was it put Irish counter-espionage skills on display for a whole bunch of journalists to write about it and spread the news around the world. So once Digby's revealed, he's basically advised to take the next boat out of Dublin, which he does. Now, on paper, the IRA is going to have pretty significant numbers. It's going to be numbers that also carry over from its predecessor unit, the Irish Volunteers. And right now, on paper, there's about 100,000 men that Collins says are on the books. But Collins estimates that only about 15,000 of them were actually active during the War of Independence, and at any given time, only about 3,000 of them are in active service. The IRA is also supported by organizations such as their women's group, the Women Auxiliaries, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Gelga enunciation of that again, as well as a youth movement that sort of helped bring up sort of the newer crop of IRA soldiers. Okay. These guys and women are going to carry weapons and intelligence for the IRA. They're going to secure them food and safe housing. And the IRA is significantly going to benefit from this widespread help, which is being given to them by the general Irish population, who were frequently doing what they felt was their patriotic duty by refusing to pass information to the RIC while they simultaneously helped IRH soldiers, oftentimes to the citizens' own detriment. Now, a great deal of their success is also going to be reliant on local leadership, so it's not all coming directly from the mouth and mind of Michael Collins. A lot of these local guys are going to have huge impacts. Leadership such as Liam Lynch, who we've mentioned, Tom Barry, Sean Moylan, Sean McOwen, and Ernie O'Malley. These guys organized aggressive and successful guerrilla activity. And because of the way the communication is working for the Irish Republican Army, a lot of this is being done on their own. Remember, I said at the beginning, there's kind of like a general operation plan. And within that, do what you think is right on the field. Okay. And so a lot of that success, you can't say is Michael Collins, because Michael Collins isn't standing on the ground where Lynch is, where McOwen is, where O'Malley is. And so those commanders have to make the decisions which ultimately prove to be successful. So you got to give those guys credit. Now, so again, talking about these guys being on their own, they had to fend for their own resources such as food and ammunition, cover, housing, things like that. And for most of the conflict, these guys are going to be most successful while they're doing this operation in the province of Munster, around the city of Dublin, where they could kind of keep their tabs on how the British respond to everything. The IRA elsewhere is really more or less just holding the ground they'd gained earlier, the territory they'd claimed back earlier in the year. Some other places where the IRA is really concentrated at the end of 1920 are in County Roscommon and then North County Longford, as well as Western County Mayo. Now, in December of 1920, fighting is going to break out in Derry. It's going to last for a week. During this time, Catholic homes are going to be attacked in the mainly Protestant community of Waterside. Catholic residents are going to flee by boat across the River Foyle while coming under fire. In Cityside, loyalists are going to be firing from the Fountain neighborhood directly down Catholic streets. While the IRA had occupied St. Columb's College and returned fire, in this fracas, at least 14 Catholics and 5 Protestants are going to be killed in the fighting. So British authorities, in response to this violence on December 10th, they're finally going to do it, Parker. They're declaring martial law.
Martial law.
Yep, and the counties of Cork, Kerry, Limerick, and Tipperary are all going to be placed in martial law. Almost all of the province of Munster, where the IRA is operating most effectively. Under the
I guess that answers my question. How they view this? They're sticking with the party line.
Yeah.
They had to just, they were coming right at us, to quote the old South Park joke.
Yep.
And they're just going to stick with it. And now they're declaring martial law. And again, great work.
Yep. So they do this under the Restoration of Ireland Act. Remember, they'd had the ability to do either or, special military area or martial law.
Yeah.
So they've decided that they're going to do it. And then the rest of the province of Munster, as well as the additional counties of Kilkenny and County Wexford in the province of Leinster, will also eventually be placed under martial law. Now, shortly afterwards, in January of 1921, official reprisals are going to be sanctioned by the British government. And these are going to begin with the burning of 7 houses in Middleton, County Cork, as well as the entire center of Cork City. Perpetrated by the Black and Tans, the British forces would go on to antagonize the situation even further by shooting at firefighters as they tried to get a handle on the blaze. By June of 1921, the number of homes that had been put to the torch under the ordered reprisals would increase to 191. The IRA response was not to burn individual homes, but was to target mansions or country estates of British landowners, and in response, they claimed credit for the burning of 26 estates during this period. So after a lull in violence in the north, as the concentration of activity had moved into the southern counties, the conflict is going to begin intensifying in Northern Ireland again in the spring of 1921. In February, as reprisals for the shooting of a special constable, USC and UFV men, Ulster Volunteer Force, USC, Ulster Special Constabulary, if I haven't said it yet, UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force. Men from these units are going to burn 10 Catholic homes and a priest's house in Rosslea and County Fermanagh, where the Maguires are from. The following month, the IRA attacked the homes of 16 special constables in Rosslea District, and they killed 3 and wounded several others. So when we were talking off mic in pre-production, I was kind of talking to you about this, like you're looking for these battles. This is what I mean.
It's a tit for tat.
Do you see how I'm kind of just like reading through these things that are happening? This is how it's happening. It's like this incident retaliated, this incident retaliates this incident, and it just keeps steamrolling.
I don't want to rabbit hole too much. The priest's house you mentioned that was burned, do we know if he was like part of the resistance? Was there any sort of it's
on that level? No, I don't know. But the Irish, I mean, the faith is involved.
Yeah. I mean, this has clearly been a Protestant versus Catholic fight for the most part. And yes, there are some Protestant dead here on the field, as it were, as a result of British tyranny.
So you can see, though, right? It's like incident after incident after incident, response, retaliation. It's like you almost forget where it all starts from. And that's this centuries of subjugation and persecution. And the Irish people have tried for, at this point now, well over 150 years kind of actively to try to end this. So
it's irredeemable. I mean, there's nothing here. There's nothing here on the English side that's just redeemable.
Right. So far, you're right. On March 19th of 1921, the IRA division leader, Tom Barry, so one of those local leaders I referenced a minute ago, he's got 100 guys in the West Cork IRA unit that he's in command of. These guys are going to fight in what is probably the largest engagement, where they go up against 1,200 British troops in what is known as the Crossbarry Ambush. Barry's men narrowly avoid being trapped by converging British columns. And, when we talk about these assassinations or these ambush things like that, the Kilmichael ambush I just referenced a minute ago claimed the lives of 17 RIC constables by the IRA. So that's a pretty big casualty count, for one of these attacks. Close to 30 British force, I don't want to say troops because they're not all British Army or police, but close to 30 British Crown Force members are going to be killed in this March 19th engagement. So just 2 days later, on March 21st, the Kerry IRA They're going to attack a train at Headford Junction near Killarney. 20 British soldiers are going to be killed or wounded. 2 IRA soldiers are going to be killed. 3 civilians are killed as well. And again, these are all smaller scale actions, and things like that. Also happening in March are going to be some ambushes at Mill Street in Cork. Scramo, I'm just going to say that, Scramo and Roscommon. And in these situations, British lorries are going to be attacked once again by IRA forces. And the results of this will be 3 British soldiers are killed, an IRC officer is killed, 2 black and tans were captured, and then subsequently shot dead shortly thereafter. And then additional IRA successes in May and June are going to be at Torque McKeady and Carroll Kennedy and Mayo, again, where they IRA ambushes are going to provide gains.